He tasted like desert metal and rain. When Anna yanked the blanket tighter around his shoulders, she felt a pulse under skin that did not belong to any creature she'd cataloged in quiet university labs or anonymous whistleblower meetings. His breath steamed in the cold, a soft, irregular staccato like a machine stuttering back to life. And when his eyes opened, they were the color of depths, ocean without shore. And for a dizzying heartbeat, she forgot every careful calculation that had kept her safe for years. Someone was screaming into the night 3 miles away, a voice laced with authority and adrenaline, and the headlights of a government convoy painted the cigarros silver. But Anna could not move. Everything in her had narrowed to the thin line of vulnerability at his throat, to the small, impossible hand she cradled, and to the first unfamiliar syllable that left his mouth like a prayer. Erith. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. They found each other because of the sound, a crash like an animal that had forgotten how to die, tearing through a ravine of red rock and brittle scrub under a sky so cold it felt like glass. Anna had been walking by habit and sleeplessness, the desert a place she'd learned to think without witnesses. She'd left the lights of Las Cruces months ago, months in which she had been careful with everything except her conscience. Between the secrecy of her former job and the public silence she'd adopted after the affidavit, she numbered her friendships like small, cracked coins. But she had never abandoned a wounded thing. That rule had pulled her toward the ruined glint at the base of a juniper, a shape half buried in dust, breathing in a cadence that suggested both machine and animal. Instruments in her pack confirmed what her sick, stubborn heart feared: no human pulse as she knew it, but a waveform, a slow, luminous heat on her handheld scanner. He was alive. He looked like a sculpture cut from moonlight, slender, elongated limbs folded against himself, skin that seemed to drink the night and send it back as faint luminescence. Anna trained her hands to be exact, bandaging, probing, suturing small tears in flesh she didn't understand. She spoke because people spoke when they thought the world might tilt back into order. "Can you hear me? Are you hurt?" Her voice sounded thinner than she felt. Practice had made her modestly brave in an emergency, but not in the presence of the impossible. The stranger's mouth formed shapes that were not words, and then, after minutes of static intakes of breath, sound came that she recognized like a key turned in a lock. Erith. It could have been a name. It could have been an entire sentence. For a woman who had already lost a place in the world for the truth she wouldn't bury, it was a new gravity. He couldn't be left. She understood that on a level that had nothing to do with scientific curiosity, because leaving him meant handing him over to the people who buried lives beneath beige concrete and classified insignia. Anna had seen the memos, traced the hidden ledger pages in back rooms and under server cabinets when she had been brave enough to look. The government did not recover relics in the desert. It collected assets and secrets and then rewrote their histories. She had learned the contours of that machinery so intimately she could find its seams with a single fingertip. She had learned, too, the price of being the person who pointed. So she wrapped him, hoisted him onto the back of her old Jeep, and drove with the headlights off, following constellations and instinct toward a house she had made fortress and exile. Her home was a caravan of stubborn things, a ramshackle prefab at the edge of town retrofitted with Faraday sheeting, a pantry of canned resilience, a study of paper maps and brittle notebooks. Inside, the stranger's limbs trembled like wind through reeds. He watched her as if he could see choice and consequence at once. He had no fear of her touch. only the quiet shiver of someone relearning what it meant to be tended by hands more fallible than his own healing. Anna Lucero, she said aloud when their shared moments slipped into the need to name. He repeated the cadence slowly, the consonants sliding into vowels that hummed on his palate. Names were fragile bridges. She had reasons to hide him that were honest and complicated. She had been a xenobiologist once, a person who cataloged and marveled without the claws of ideology digging at her wrists. Then she had become a whistleblower, a woman whose testimony had been stripped of context and repackaged as hysteria. The old photos of her in a lab coat, soft smile, eyes too tired for the placard, had been replaced on bulletin boards with a different face, a cautionary tale. Agents had come to her door once. She had not answered then because that was when she had learned to be invisible and to count the intervals between breaths. But invisibility had a cost: solitude, the erosion of touch. Hiding Aerith was also a rebellion against that ledger. It was a way to prove to herself that she still mattered in the world she wanted to save. Language was a patient thing between them. He learned that the length of her fingers meant soft reprimand when she tapped a bandage, that laughter came from the small tug of muscles around her eyes. She learned that his skin was cool and faintly conductive, that placing her palm against his chest produced a communication of light that she couldn't read, beautiful as static. They found a shared alphabet in small gestures and in the way chromosomes of grief rearranged themselves into a new code. Aerith taught her a ribbon of his language by pressing his thumb into the dust and making shapes, ovals, lines, spirals that felt like maps. She taught him coffee, the slow, bitter ceremony by which humans judge their mornings. When he tasted it, his face broke in a way she would come to understand as awe. But hiding was only the first thread of a braid that would tighten until it cut. Word traveled in systems that were not humane and not likened by conscience. The convoy's roar that had faded at first came back with coordination and steel, a machine built to operate on certainty. Colonel Mateo Reyes was the name on the operations manifest, clean, official, morally absolute. He had spent years shaping an apparatus to suppress anomalies. His public face was duty, his private face, rumor, a man who had carried a missing daughter's shadow like a medal. Anna had seen his signature on directives that had stripped families of their stories. To the people he served, this was protection. To him, control was a kind of mercy. To Anna, it was personal. The first time the drones came low over the canyon, she hid Aerith in the crawlspace beneath her trailer and set out decoys. Burned tire chacks, scattered rags, the scent of stale coffee poured into sand to throw the dogs off course. She learned the cadence of raids as if studying a new species. How officers sought linear patterns, how they discounted the illogical. Anna used that distrust, the paranoia that had kept her alive, and it gave her days of safety. Days that stretched until the net closed again, and she realized she was no longer making decisions about a specimen in a cage. She was deciding how to love something everyone else viewed as leverage. Inside the small room where he slept and mended, Aerith's eyes tracked the little light bulbs Anna left on at night. He watched her sleep as if memorizing the drift of her face. When he woke, he would place a hand on the gap in the wall and make a soft sound that Anna learned to interpret as grief for distance. Night after night, she kept watch with a scanner and a battered pistol that felt absurd in her hands. She did not delude herself that the gun could stop the apparatus that had men like Reyes behind it. It merely allowed her the illusion of agency. The real weapons were patience and knowledge. Her notes, the photographs she had managed to copy before leaving, the memory of a server room she had unlocked once with a phrase borrowed from a colleague she'd trusted too briefly. Those memories were both resource and punishment. They taught how to dismantle walls and also reminded her of how easily trust could be punished. Aerith's revelations came like fragments of a mirror. Pieces that, when held to the light, reflected something terrifying and gorgeous. He showed her a palm-sized device that was neither crystal nor metal, but sang when she breathed on it. Inside were schematics that were not human-made, and coordinates that were layered like a map of veins. He hesitated when she reached for it, as if the act of understanding might wound him again. She promised quietly that she would use knowledge to free, not to bind. To the ripple of stars in his sclera, that was a language worth learning. Yet, despite the tenderness that grew in stolen mornings and delayed raids, Anna could not stop cataloging risks as if auditing a ledger. How many more nights before the patrols widened? How long could she feed a being whose biochemistry did not fit the refrigerator already cluttered with cans and rice? How many lines would she have to cross to ensure both their safeties? When she lay awake, the room full of diagrams and dust motes, she wrote his name until the script blurred. Writing had always been an act of survival. This time, it felt like liturgy. There was one night when the wind came down off the mesa hard enough to make the trailer shiver, and Anna found herself laughing with a fierce, sharp edge because the mathematics of possibility had shifted. Aerith kept his head on her shoulder and made a sound she would remember as the beginning of wanting. It was not quite love. He had not been made for the private economies of human attachment, but it was a fascination that approached devotion. He copied her hands, the slope of her jaw, the freckle behind her ear, the way a student copies a teacher's script. He asked simple things. What did she fear most? And learned from the tightness in her answer that she feared being alone more than anything. Aerith did not understand loneliness in the human sense. He cataloged lack as a void between colonies. Still, he sat closer, his body heat warming the hollowed place loneliness had made in her chest. The first letter arrived in a padded envelope with no return address 2 days later. Anna opened it with the mechanical care of someone who had been betrayed enough to make ritual out of suspicion. Inside were images, grainy photographs taken from above, angles that revealed a building she had seen only from satellite images, a concrete star lodged in a dust bowl ringed by antennae. The object at its center was parked like a secret altar. On the back of one photograph were 3 words in a handwriting she recognized: Reyes, Endgame. Her hands went slick. She had expected threats, interrogations, subtle bribes. She had not expected the brisk, efficient certainty that sounded like the closing of a trap. She sat down hard on the cot, Aerith's head in her lap, and felt the weight of all the choices crowd her lungs. This was the night when the small, quiet bargains of survival hardened into a terrible clarity. If she stayed, someone she loved, someone whose species had never known the word love, might be taken and used as currency. If she fled, she would be leaving a diplomat to an apparatus that did not know what mercy meant. The desert had always been a place of hard choices, of mirages and offsets, where the horizon seemed promising and treacherous at once. Anna had come to this landscape to be alone and to keep certain truths like coal in her pocket, hot and dangerous and capable of lighting fires if someone foolish enough struck a match. Now the flames licking at the edges of her life demanded a new reckoning. When dawn came, the convoy's radio chatter had a different urgency. The photograph's sender had not intended kindness. Information was an instrument. Anna dressed in deliberate silence and placed Aerith's limp hand in hers. She had never been a heroine in the stories she'd told herself. She had been careful and fierce and honest in the way of people who know their own fallibility. But the caravan of government vehicles, the patient hum of drones edging closer like hungry flies, and the photograph's blunt warning carved the world into 2 readable choices. She could no longer measure her life in small increments. The axis had tilted, and anything she did next would be counted in lives and the ruin or repair they left behind. She had to choose. The choice felt like a bone being split. She could hand him over and watch the machine that had eaten so many other people's lives accept another asset, catalog it, and eventually codify its usefulness into moral silence. Or she could fight, not with the fantasy of a Hollywood rescue, but with the dull, stubborn tools she owned. A few contacts who still trusted her enough to answer a burner number. The stack of copied files with enough holes to build a kite. Knowledge of how to move through bureaucracy like a shadow. The photograph in her hand was the lever. Whoever had sent it had the eagerness of a predator. They wanted her to act, to expose herself. They counted on her conscience. Aerith watched. He had learned to watch in habits that seemed like prayer. At first, his attention had been curiosity. How she folded maps, how her fingers trembled when she lied to herself about safety. Later, it became something warmer and more dangerous, a measuring. He traced the line of her jaw with a fingertip one morning, the light making his skin look like it held tiny galaxies in suspension, and she felt as if she might combust under the intensity of being so noticed. There were times when he made small human noises, attempts at laughter, disconcerting imitations of despair, and she would catch herself leaning toward him as if he were the only music she remembered how to dance to. The paralysis ended because it had to. Anna put the photographs back in the envelope, folded the edges with a nervous precision, and made a plan as if she were charting a constellation. She listed the variables aloud: safe houses, routes, her contact in El Paso who owed her a favor for reasons she did not entirely want to catalog. She tallied the unknowns: how much time, how many officers, whether Arith could survive even the short flights he would likely need away from human medicine. Each unknown narrowed into a single insoluble question that Anna had learned the hard way not to ignore. Who do you have if you have nothing but truth? Do you understand? She asked him, because questions were the currency she could afford. Arith's hands made the spiral he'd used as a map. He lifted his eyes, and the ocean in them had a slow ache. He did not have the human story of understanding, no past woven with domestic rituals, no calendar of birthdays or funerals, but he had a record of what certain patterns meant across stellar distances. He knew the posture of a pursuer, the geometry of an evader. He touched her cheek with an alien gentleness that made the fine hair at the base of her neck stand up. Whatever degree of comprehension dwelt inside him, whatever the translation of his species' diplomacy into the human terms she could access, it was enough. He would go with her. They moved at night, because the desert at night swallowed secrets better than daylight did. Aerith's body adapted to the cold with a metabolism she could only describe as alien thrift, soft adjustments that left him shivering less than Anna expected. He watched the sky as if it were a manual. He learned to interpret the way she breathed when she was nervous, and in turn, he taught her to listen for the subtle harmonic change in the air that preceded drone activity. She thought of the reports she'd filed at the tail end of her career, the ones that no one had wanted to read, and realized with a cold smile that she now lived inside the exact scenarios she had tried to warn about. The first time they were almost caught, it was not the opulent militarized sweep she'd imagined, but one small human error. A neighbor's mailbox light left on, a kid on a pickup barreling down a dirt lane and spotting headlights that didn't belong. Anna had the reflexive terror of someone who had once seen friend and colleague detained after a chance greeting at a coffee shop. She gripped Aerith's arm and dragged him into a run behind mesquite, gravel biting their palms. They lay in the dust, lungs burning, while a pickup rattled past and the boy shouted, "Did you see that? Lights over by the old transmitter." Their lives seemed to hinge on the hallucinations of adolescence. The near miss introduced new cracks. The comfort of secrecy had been provisional and always brittle. Anna tightened every safe protocol she'd ever taught herself. She taught Aerith to mimic local fauna, howling like coyotes and raising his vocal timbre to trick cursory scans into dismissing him as animal noise. He learned to compress his body against the earth to let the thermal imaging pass over him as if he were a stone. Watching him, the way his spine bowed like a reed in a wind, Anna felt a tiny, burning pride. He was learning to embody humanity's small deceptions for survival. In exchange, she was being taught the poetry of his species, nonverbal communions that left her bewildered and brave. They also gathered allies in small, dangerous increments. Anna called an old colleague, Margot, under the pretense of needing help with a research grant. Margot answered the first time, then the third, then on a stormy Wednesday night when the line governments used to track whistleblowers was longer than usual, and Margot's voice finally carried the faint tremor that meant she was leaning toward risk. Margot met Anna on the edge of town with a thermos of coffee and the cool, knowing glance of someone who had once believed she could fix the brokenness of institutions. "You know what this will do to you," Margot said, not accusatory but practical, a friend who had seen people burn for truth and watched the flames consume them. "I know," Anna said, "and I know what they'll do to him." Margot's acceptance came with the weight of a bargain. She could not fully step into the breach. She had a mortgage and a child and a life that demanded pragmatic cowardice, but she could provide a list of contacts who owed favors, a safe house in the mountains with enough old gear to look like a scavenger's paradise, and the kind of alibi that came packaged in someone else's credibility. Margot's help bought them time, and time was currency in a war with an apparatus built to make time run out in small, irreversible pieces. Between raids and stolen compassion, Anna found herself teaching Aerith to read maps the human way, north anchored at the top, scale reduced to a fraction. He puzzled lovingly over contour lines, palmed them, and then drew his own overlays with the circle and line language his species used. When the overlays matched, they found a cache of coordinates that suggested not just an emergency landing, but a possible network. Modules, underground docking bays, places where human and non-human design had been married with clinical efficiency. The diagrams were both a promise and a threat. They contained routes for escape and clues about a program so deep it had eroded the concept of consent. The emotional terrain between them grew more complicated with every discovery. Aerith was learning to name the small human verbs, hesitate, promise, betray, by watching Anna practice them in the way she rationed milk or prioritized a battery. She, in turn, learned to translate his silences. Sometimes his quietness was shame. Sometimes it was calculation. Once, when she asked him whether his species had ever known love, he made the spiral map and then placed both palms over his heart in a gesture that was part mimicry and part revelation. He did not need to walk through human history to understand attachments. He had existed in a polity where affection was entangled with duty at scales beyond her imagination. To him, loving her was a new calculus. The tension rose not only from external threats, but from internal betrayals. Anna had saved files before she fled the lab, fragments of video, names redacted, and then annotated with cruelly spare notes. She had been careful, but a lifetime of living in the margins had made her nervous in ways that sometimes sabotaged her. Once, in a low sleep, she left a notebook with coordinates within reach of a window where a wind could pick it up. It vanished by morning. She imagined 100 possibilities: thieves, crows, a young boy with a taste for paper. But the truth she feared most was that someone within their narrow circle had begun trading in information for reasons she couldn't yet name. Margot reassured her that the loss could be mitigated. Margot's network had backups. But the theft planted a seed of panic that Anna could not shake. The idea of betrayal, of an internal fracture that would hand Aerith to Reyes on a silver platter, could not be filtered through rational cost-benefit analyses. It lodged into a deeper, older fear, that she would be the vector of damage because she had opened her life to risk. That her desire to be noticed, to matter, would be the very thing that allowed a government to expand its ledger of dominion. Reyes tightened his net, not with spectacle, but with paperwork and patience. He deployed men she had once argued with in committee meetings, officials who now had a new moral clarity when standing on the other side of secrecy. They issued warrants with precise legal language that scraped against the law like a blade. They used journalists with a hunger for scoop to paint Anna as a paranoid ex-scientist. They leaked images that suggested cult-like devotion, and for a time, the public spun away like dust from the tires of a passing truck. Anna had no illusions about the way narrative could twist power into righteousness. She only had the stubbornness that made her keep a file under the false bottom of a kitchen drawer, and the knowledge that she would have to risk everything to enact the truth she wanted to bring into daylight. One night, when the sky had the bruised purple of late summer and the coyotes closer than usual, Anna and Erith sat outside the trailer with a solar lantern between them. The hum of a distant generator and the thump of her own heart filled the silence. She had been tallying routes on the floor and had a map with enough pins to look like someone who believed in contingency. Erith touched the pins and named each one as if it were a person. "This one," he said, and the word that came out of him was less a syllable than a place. A remnant of a spaceport, a memory pocket for his people. Anna had to resist the urge to collapse into the knowledge that the net was not closed entirely. There were still threads of exit. "I can get you there," she said, not as a promise, but as a plan. "But I'm not a soldier, Erith. I can violate laws and hide bodies and steal documents. I can't outmaneuver an entire base." He understood that. He placed his palm on hers, and for the first time, his fingers tightened in what she recognized as a vow. "Then we make the world too costly to keep quiet," he said, in his slow, guttural way, his voice a melody of broken consonants and longing. They both knew the truth of that strategy. Exposure could force the system into a visible moral choice, but it could also provoke escalation. The calculus of truth had no guarantees. Which was the point? Anna had survived by making difficult choices. Now, when a man like Reyes polished his uniform and tied his message into legal knots, she felt the gravity of history pressing down. She had everything to lose: friends, anonymity, possibly life itself. And she had something to gain that no ledger could quantify: the right to stand in daylight with someone whose existence a government had declared inconvenient. She looked at Erith and understood that whatever came next would not be a moment, but a war of attrition, where tenderness would be ammunition and truth would be an act of defiance. Dawn would bring a convoy. Between the last night and the sunrise were the small human economies of courage, planning a route that no one had considered, burning false leads, making allies in the shape of a whispered rumor that would throw Reyes off their scent. The desert tightened into silence, and both of them knew that the next moves would be taken not in the abstract, but in the specific anatomy of fear. Which road to take, whom to trust with a key, whether to leave footprints leading away from the truth or toward a trap. Anna folded the map, put it back into her pocket, and tasted the coffee she had heated for them. It was cold and bitter and exactly what she wanted. Erith watched her drink and made a sound like appreciation. They rose together, a pair against a world built to disassemble their connection. The push and pull had taught them both how fragile courage could be, how it needed to be shared and nurtured to keep from snapping. The desert, patient and indifferent, held its breath. They stepped into the morning with a plan stitched from desperation and love, and the knowledge that somewhere beyond the horizon, Reyes readied his own actions like a surgeon preparing for an incision. They thought the night would belong to them. Instead, it belonged to the small betrayals that accumulate until they are indistinguishable from fate. Before dawn, a message arrived on a burner phone Margot had taught Anna to use like a blade. Short, brittle, without flourish. Location compromised. Move, now. No signature, no time for gratitude. Anna's throat closed like a fist. She shoved the map back into her pocket with hands that trembled as if the desert's chill had found the marrow. Aerith watched her, pupils reflecting the lantern's halo, and his hand sought hers exactly as if it could anchor the physics of what was coming. They moved quietly, practiced in the ways of people who had spent too much time avoiding other people's plans. Their Jeep was a dark shape slipping away from the trailer, tires whispering over gravel, the engine exhaling dust like a ghost. Anna left behind the little reliquary of their life. Notes, half-drunk cups of coffee, a pair of socks drying by the heater. As if she could make loss domestic and therefore bearable. Aerith's body fit into the seat with a strange grace. He had learned to fold like a paper animal, limbs aligned to minimize signature. For the first time since she had found him, Anna felt an acute, public sense of exposure. She was not only a woman running, but a woman who had made space for an impossible other inside her life. They drove away from the trailer, but not from the ache. Anna felt it in the rhythm of her hands on the wheel, in the tiny calculus of turns and rest stops. Her mind pinged between logistics and a private, noisier grief. What would it mean if they were forced to leave behind everything Aerith had started to learn about human smallness? The taste of coffee, the word for lullaby, the way her freckle became a geography he traced with reverence. The thought of a future without that quiet curriculum fouled her breath. She had learned to measure grief by its textures. This one had the rawness of a newly torn fabric. They took a back route Margot had sketched from memory, a sinew of dirt roads that threaded through mesas and abandoned farms. The sky was a bruise. Anna drove with a mixture of practiced economy and the irrational hope that speed could outrun consequence. After an hour, she pulled over at a wash where scrub hid the road like a hand. She killed the engine and listened. The stillness hummed like a held note. Aerith's hand came to her face, brushing the line of her jaw as if memorizing the topography anew. "We wait," he said, in broken, soft syllables that had begun to arrange themselves into patience. "We adapt." They waited, and time did strange things. It could be a balm that sewn wounds around the edges, or it could be a slow corrosive. At dusk, the silence broke. Two figures emerged from shadow at the edge of the wash. Margot, her hair tucked under a ball cap, and someone Anna had not expected. Javier, a name from a file, a man who had once been one of Anna's inside contacts, and then a rumor, then nothing. He had clean hands and eyes that carried the weather of secrets. Anna's stomach dropped. Trust, once split open, bled unpredictably. "There's been movement," Javier said, the kind of sentence that balanced mercies and threats on a knife edge. "Reyes is widening the net. He wants to press you publicly, turn this into a grab that'll justify anything they do after." Anna's hand tightened on Aerith's. She had seen Reyes in hearings. She had felt his kind of containment like a physical pressure. "How much time?" she asked. Her voice was even. Inside, panic ran like gasoline. "Not much," Javier said. Margot's jaw was set like a trap. She handed Anna a small envelope. Photos, angles, a map inked with routes. But there was something else tucked between the pages. A printout of a catalog, a ledger of names and identification numbers. Anna's chest stuttered. Her name was not there, but Aerith's designation, what Reyes' office had called Object ER7, had language beside it that tasted of bureaucratic hunger. Priority asset. The words were sterile, but they carried appetite. "There's a price being offered," Javier said quietly. "Information. People will trade for your head." He looked at Aerith with a level gaze that made Anna's spine feel simultaneously proud and exposed. Someone's already taken it. We caught the kid who tried to fence coordinates. He'd been paid in cash and in promises. He talked. The revelation landed like a blow. It was not that information had been sold. It was that people could be bought with such ease. Anna had slept at night because she believed in the stubbornness of conscience. Now she saw conscience for sale, and the currency was affection, fear, need. She had never been naive about human frailty, but hearing the transactional language of betrayal shocked her in a way academic treachery never did. She felt suddenly the full weight of being the axis on which others tipped towards safety or ruin. Aerith's hand tightened in hers until she felt the quick of his pulse press against her palm. He had begun to attend to subtler human cues, guilt, hesitation, the way someone averts their gaze when they fear being seen as complicit. "Who?" he asked, his voice like coral scraping rock. It was the only word he used for inquiry, but Anna understood its force. Who would turn friend into ledger? Margot swallowed. "You know the name Anna tried to protect," she said. "Noelle. She was on Margot's list. She'd been a cleaner at a depot, had access to manifests. She couldn't help it." Margot's face softened and then hardened. "She came to us crying. She had threats. They said they'd take her kid." Anna's hands went numb. Noelle. An image surfaced. A woman with tired eyes, who'd once brought supplies and smiled like apology. Anna had seen pity in Noelle's hands and had offered her friendship as both contraband and support. The possibility that Noelle had broken, that she'd offered them something like coordinates or a notebook in exchange for her child's safety, was a pain with the shape of an accusation. "She handed over a partial file," Margot continued, eyes on Anna. "Not everything, but enough for Reyes to tighten the screws. He thinks he's closing the narrative. He thinks he can make you look like an unstable hoarder of a myth." Anna's first impulse was to feel anger at Noelle, at the fracture, but anger came leached thin by a bigger and meaner understanding. There was no purity in survival. People made dark bargains under the weight of fear. Anna had once expected allies to act according to her own arithmetic of courage. That expectation was a child of privilege. The desert taught a different calculus, one where small, private betrayals were often sacrifices for love. Aerith's face was a study in complex comprehension. He did not moralize, he cataloged outcomes. "So they used children," he said bluntly. It was less of condemnation and more an observation fitted into a taxonomy of coercion. He had seen such instruments in his people's colonial archives, where leverage was an art and compassion a liability. The real fracture arrived in a shape Anna had not anticipated, a legal sting. 2 hours after they met with Margot and Javier, as dusk smeared like old bruises across the plain, a satellite pinged near their route. A camera had caught a vehicle that fit Anna's Jeep's profile. Someone had reported a suspicious vehicle. The informer did not need to be Noelle. Someone else could have seen the Jeep and chosen money over silence. But for Anna, the betrayal nested in the heart, because it meant they were tracked not only by state, but by the small, stumbling moral compromises of ordinary people. "Move," Javier hissed, pulling them into the scrub with a force that left prickles across Anna's skin. They ran. Emrith's long legs ate ground like a thing born for different gravity. Anna pushed her body through panic and grit, arms burning from exertion. They dove into a ravine and waited while the sky went black. Distant motors coughed and faded, as if some unseen hand played with them like a cat with a trapped bird. When they emerged, shaken and breathless, Anna realized she had been carrying a buried terror as if it were a necessary ballast, that once people saw the cost of truth, they would refuse to pay it. Dignity, loyalty, even friendship, These were luxuries in a landscape where people bartered them like goods. She felt foolish for expecting something other than a marketplace. The fracture widened further when Margot, in a moment that betrayed the cowardly geometry of compromise, offered a plan that involved handing over partial proof to a journalist in exchange for a decoy operation. "It will draw eyes away," she said. "It will make Reyes spend resources chasing what isn't there." The tactic was strategic, but to Anna it felt like another kind of confession. They would leak lies to protect the larger truth. There would be no clean path. "You would risk making him a spectacle," Anna said. Her voice trembled with a dislocated moral language. She had traded this terrain before. "You want to turn him into a headline. Public eyes do not mean justice." Margot's face blurred with fatigue. "What would you have us do? Sit in the dark and wait for Reyes' men to take him? Let him be catalogued?" Her hands were earnest, roughened by the practical cruelty of someone who knew she might lose friends to every choice she made. Aerith watched them, and for the first time, Anna saw something pure and terrifying. His disappointment was not personal. It was structural. He pronounced a word that in his language meant both duty and gloss: balance. To him, decisions were measured in networks and survival of cultures, not in moral absolutes. The phrase unsettled Anna because it made her human panic look like a local superstition against a cosmic calculus she had not been taught. That night, after they set up a decoy and watched authorities swarm false leads, Anna discovered another fissure, one she had carried inside her from the day she left the lab. She had not told Aerith about the full extent of her past, the names she had whispered to Congress, the list she'd tried to effect change with, the colleague she'd trusted who had introduced her to a man who later testified against her. Secrecy had been a shield, omission had been armor. But when the decoy worked and a small unit moved to raid the fake cache, Reyes responded with a lethal flood, warrants, subpoenas, and an executive statement that painted Anna as a traitor to national safety. Margot called from a payphone, voice brittle. "They're pulling everything into court. They have a witness that can tie your previous employer to clandestine contracts. If Reyes proves the breach, they can claim Aerith was collusion." "Collusion?" Anna said. The word had a taste of iron. She had never imagined her intent could be reframed as treachery. The strap of betrayal tightened further because the witness Reyes used was a former subordinate of Anna's, a woman Anna had once mentored. The woman had injuries no ledger could weigh. She had been moved to cooperation by promises Anna could not imagine refusing: safety, the return of a sibling, an annuity paid for quiet years. Her testimony was surgical. It carved narrative from chaos, and in the public domain, narrative became tribunal. Anna felt, in that raw hour, the splintering of her own identity. She had taken pride in being principled. The system turned principle into spectacle, and then used the spectacle to circumscribe reality. She watched Aerith as their world narrowed into headlines, and felt his confusion at human law's appetite to render meaning from moral muddle. "Why do you not stop them?" he asked once, eyes reflecting a constellation of hurt. "Your people make rules and then break them for you. You speak and they bind you." The question landed like an accusation, but it was no more than true. Anna did not have an answer that did not hum with shame. She had tried to be a voice. The apparatus had turned her voice into a liability. The fractures multiplied. Trust eroded between allies who chose survival in could-be ways, between Anna and the people who had once been her colleagues, and between Anna and the fragile love she had begun to accept from an impossible stranger. By the time Reyes escalated, press conferences, the release of doctored images hinting at cult behavior, the legal classifying of Irith as unauthorized biological entity, Anna realized that the worst fracture was not institutional but intimate. News vans camped outside the safe house Javier had arranged. A woman who had once done laundry for Margot now eyed Irith like a commodity. The world decided to look with hunger, and when the world looks hungry, it bites. In those days, bonds they had believed solid began to crack. Margot retreated into a pragmatic silence that looked for all the world like survival. Javier disappeared into errands and then into blame, his eyes darting like someone who expected doorways to be pried open at any moment. Noelle's name circulated in whisper like a contagion. Each fracture was an erosion. People who could have been bridges turned into vectors for fear because fear bought them what they wanted most. And the cruelest break of all unfolded in a courtroom painting the nation with righteousness. A recorded deposition of Anna's past life, a conclusion the legal machinery drew like a slow, precise incision. She watched, shoulder to shoulder with Irith and Margot, as the state's case framed her not as a hero, but as a manipulator who had endangered national security for sentiment. The prosecutor's voice was a scalpel. "You chose personal attachment over country," he said. And in that sentence, the public forgave itself the violence to come. Irith's hands went cold in hers. He had learned grief and strategy, but he had not learned how people like Reyes used law to convert fear into assent. He had believed, perhaps naively, that truth would be a lever. Instead, truth was being folded into the state's narrative and used to justify further concealment. Anna felt rage swell like a tidal undercurrent, but it was raw and unfocused, the kind of anger grief wears when it has not yet counted its losses. In the end, Act 3 closed around them with the sound of evidence lockers slamming and names being redacted from lists. Reyes, who had worn the pain of a missing daughter like armor, had found a new way to generalize loss into public policy. He tightened the screws until the room's oxygen felt thin. The fractures they bore were many. Friends who traded privacy for safety. Legal instruments turned into weapons. A public that cheered its own ignorance. Anna and Irith retreated into the smallest possible geography of intimacy, where promises could still be exchanged without audience. They held each other in a hotel room under another name, under fluorescent lights that made Irith's skin seem bluer than the night. Against the hum of the air conditioning, they pledged again, not with the grandness of vows, but with a practical tenderness, to stay together through the ruin, to protect what remained. Their love was a decision now, less romance, more strategy. Yet it was the fiercest thing they possessed. It would have to be, because the fractures outside were not simple wounds to be bandaged, but tectonic shifts that would demand new landscapes to be drawn from the ashes. They moved like thieves beneath a thin moon, boots and breath synchronized into a small drum of defiance. The safe house stank of wet wool and fear. Margot had left them a corridor of dry clothes and a makeshift plan that read like a prayer for human error. Anna felt, in each small motion, locking a latch, passing a packet, angling a camera away, the pressure of a world that would prefer to invent monsters rather than reckon with its failures. Reyes had sharpened law into a weapon. Anna would have to turn exposure into armor. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. Irith watched her with a patience that had become their quiet currency. He understood tactics the way weather understood pressure systems. Remove a node and the storm rerouted, not ended. "We make a visible wound," he said once, voice thick with the consonants he'd borrowed from her language. They will see, and then they must choose, mend or cover. It was not bravado. It was a calculation drawn from diplomatic tragedies he had catalogued across star-swept archives. Anna folded that logic into her map and into her chest. Love had become strategy. They built a sting that used Reyes's own appetite against him. Margot leaked a staged set of coordinates, an irresistible breadcrumb that would suggest a vulnerable transfer point. Javier fed the rumor through a sympathetic reporter who loved good prose more than policy. Anna prepared the proof she would release, an incontrovertible artifact Aerith had given her, a crystalline device that, under human analysis, would reveal engineering signatures impossible to fake. If the government moved to seize it, she would broadcast the seizure live through burnt satellite connections and sympathetic feeds Margot still trusted. It was theater and trap, truth dressed in a net. The night the operation went live, the desert smelled of ozone and adrenaline. Aerith perched on the hood of the decoy vehicle like a statue reborn, looking small and planetary at once. Anna's fingers trembled as she keyed a transmission. She had rehearsed every contingency, but rehearsal did not soften the shape of panic. The first team to arrive were not soldiers, but procurement officers, bureaucrats who wore authority like gloves. They kicked at the evidence, cataloged it, performed the motions of legality while cameras watched. Reyes himself arrived later, all clean lines and cold certainty, and when he stepped from the vehicle, Anna's throat went dry. He did not come with guns flaring. He came with a smile that finally found purchase in a public that understood punishment. "Dr. Lucero," he said, voice steady as arbitration, "I am placing you under a temporary protective custody for both your sake and the investigation's integrity." It was a theater of civility. Anna read the script and felt her skin peel. Beside her, Aerith made a low sound that was neither fear nor acceptance, but the syntax of recognition. There were plays humans staged to make violence legal. Anna did what she had always done when institutions tried to fold her into their signage. She spoke truth aloud, slow and naked. She broadcasted the crystalline device's signature, the coordinates, the ledger pages Margot had smuggled. She narrated what Reyes men tried to file away as evidence of threat. Names of sub-bases, manufacturing cells, a pattern of colonization dressed as paternalism. Her words unrolled like tape. They were messy, human, and therefore dangerously convincing. People who watched saw instead of being told. They saw the rusted chain of custody, the officers who hesitated, the tremor in a reporter's pen. Reyes reacted the way men trained to believe in order do when the order is exposed, with escalation. He moved to seize the device and to detain Aerith. Javier, who had once been careful to remain useful to both sides, made a choice in a fraction of time that counted like thunder. He shoved a smoke grenade into the path of the officers and roared a human alarm. Margot, with the slow efficiency of someone who had learned to lie to protect love, grabbed the live feed and rerouted it through an old satellite contact, splintering the state's control. Chaos grew honest for the first time. Officers scrambled. Drones buzzed like angry insects. Reyes barked orders that dissolved into confusion when the public feed magnified the scene into a national spectacle. Anna seized the moment. She stepped forward, hand on the crystalline device, and offered herself in a way she had never allowed, as witness and human shield. "You may take me," she said, voice steady though her heart hammered, "but you cannot take this without the world watching." It was a bargain that traded personal liberty for exposure. Aerith's hand found hers and squeezed, anchoring the sacrifice in a tenderness that felt like a compass. Reyes looked at Aerith then, really looked, And for the first time, the veneer of ideological certainty cracked. The man who had folded loss into policy felt something like shame. His jaw flexed. He ordered that Anna be detained, but the apparatus could not move with its old surgical confidence while cameras cast every gesture into argument. People had seen the officer's hesitation. Some began to shout, others filmed. Lawyers and human rights groups demanded hearings in real time. The machinery of removal slowed under human scrutiny. In the scramble, Aerith did the thing Anna had feared and secretly hoped. He chose to act, not to be acted upon. He slipped his fingers free and climbed the low berm that separated the scene from the convoy. He did not attack. His motion was a careful, alien liturgy. He reached the crystalline device, held it aloft, and activated it. Light poured from the object in a pattern that translated, not into language, but into image and memory. The screen feeds filled with visuals, not just schematics, but faces, habitats, translational logs that showed collaboration and coercion woven together. The public could not unsee what poured from the artifact, the evidence of programs and the faces of those removed. The broadcast changed the calculus. Reyes, who had driven so long on the currency of secrecy, suddenly confronted visibility as an adversary. He barked orders that no longer fit the space he occupied. Protesters gathered as live links spread, and too many eyes turned from fear to moral outrage. In that liminal minute, Anna's sacrifice sharpened into purpose. She stepped between Aerith and an approaching soldier and let herself be cuffed, but not without smiling at Aerith, a small, private benediction. "Go," she mouthed. "Find home." He hesitated only a breath. Then, with the strange dignity of a species that understood duty beyond possession, he kissed her forehead, soft, ineffably reverent, and moved away into the crowd, slipping through a seam of humanity newly agitated into defense. Anna felt the contact like a promise and a wound. She allowed herself to be taken, knowing the world would watch, and that watching could be a kind of mercy. As they led her toward a vehicle, Aerith's voice filtered through the din, low and insistent. "Anna," he said, using the name he had learned as liturgy, "we rebuild." The words were simple, but they bent like light. For a moment, Anna saw not a trial, but the possibility of translation, of torn policies mended by attention, of private love surviving the public crucible. She was scared and brave and utterly alive. Reyes stood frozen under satellite light, a man who had built walls, now facing the glare that dissolves mortar. He had a conscious choice in that moment: tighten the screws and risk a collapse of public consent, or begin the dangerous, humiliating work of reckoning. He chose the former, for now, and Anna felt the cold of a cell grate against her palm. But the device had already spread its contagion. Facts that could be filed away no longer stayed buried. The sacrifice she made by stepping between Aerith and capture had bought them time, however precarious, to transform panic into politics. As the convoy pulled away, sirens and shouts in a wild chorus behind it, Anna watched Aerith recede, not a defeated exile, but a being who had learned the cost of attachment and had paid it in motion. In the back of the transport, handcuffed but defiant, she smiled through the taste of dust and iron. Love, she realized, was not a sanctuary, but an engine. It made people act beyond calculation. For the first time in years, Anna felt the vertigo of possibility rather than the narrowness of survival. The act of claiming him had become a sacrament, and the world, hurting, messy, finally looking, would have to answer. They drove the story out into daylight, and then, impossibly, the world began to rearrange itself around that light. Weeks unspooled like frayed ribbon, Hearings convened, activists organized, journalists who had once chewed on official press releases now held up footage that would not be snuffed. Reyes retreated into legal maneuvering. His power remained vast, but the public glare introduced slowness where he had expected obedience. The crystalline devices broadcast seeded questions that could not be legislated away. Human institutions flinched under scrutiny and, for the first time, were forced to answer in public. Anna spent those weeks in an antiseptic room with thin walls and thinner promises. She was not free, but imprisonment felt less like erasure and more like crucible. Margot and Javier worked courtside. Lawyers turned document leaks into subpoenas. Aerith, when he could be reached through intermediaries and encrypted channels, sent fragments, maps stitched into song, a letter pressed into a translator's palm. He moved across borders the way weather moves, leaving small green patches of diplomacy in places that had never learned to greet aliens with language instead of guns. The exchanges were halting and brave. Small hearings opened pathways for observers and for advocates to speak of consent. Families of those once taken testified with trembling authority. Reyes fought every inch. His career's foundations creaked. But something subtle had shifted. The public had seen, and seeing often forces a reweighing. It did not heal everything, but it made harm visible and therefore contestable. When Anna was finally allowed a controlled visit, Aerith came like an emissary from another planet, and also like a lover who had learned to wait. He stood outside the glass with hands pressed flat to the barrier, an impossible silhouette traced in morning light. For a moment, they were children again, inventing constellations with their fingertips. He had learned human patience. She had learned that patience could be militant. They talked about small things first. Coffee, a word he liked now, the freckle behind her ear. And then about larger ones, reparations, recognition, safe corridors for beings displaced by state programs. Their love had morphed into work, into a tender insistence that policy catch up with compassion. Aerith pledged to his people that he would not abandon the humans who had sheltered him. Anna pledged to keep naming the names that had been buried. Reyes was eventually forced into oversight hearings. He defended himself with the brittle dignity of a man who had believed secrecy saved lives. The outcome was messy and imperfect. Resignations, inquiries, some prosecutions, obfuscations that lingered. But structural cracks became visible pathways. New protocols were proposed, oversight boards, diplomatic channels, protections drafted in language that tasted of hard-won humility. Months later, Anna stood at the edge of a refurbished landing pad outside a facility reimagined as an exchange site rather than a vault. Aerith descended in a small convoy of his people and greeted her with a brightness that had nothing to do with spectacle and everything to do with recognition. They did not erase loss. There were still names unreturned, families shredded by secrecy. But they reclaimed story. In the dust, hand in hand, they planted a small stone engraved with words in both languages. We remember, we rebuild. The desert watched, indifferent and ancient, while two species learned how to be less monstrous to each other. Anna felt, for the first time in a long while, that exposure had become a kind of medicine. She and Aerith walked into a bright, new ordinary, fragile, dangerous, real, and in that ordinary they found each other again, not as assets, but as companions who had been brave enough to insist that love mattered more than ledger.